Get ready for an unfiltered and uncensored listening experience.
Gender reveal.
Ginawa.
Naisisipin ko, ako yung tipo ng tao na pag dumating ako sa puntong sagot na sagot na talaga.
Benta niya 90 million. Where can you find that?
Don. God
Where can you
damn.
find that?
Hello, I'm back. And we are live. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Nick.
Thank you so much for coming to the podcast.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right. Um, so just to let the audience get in to the conversation, um, I think it's better if I'm gonna let you introduce yourself.
Okay, sure. I'm Suzanne. I'm from Vancouver, Canada, and I am a grieving mom and have become a grief educator. So my path to that was after the death of my son, Ben. He died in September 2020 when he was 22. And that version of grief, as you can imagine, was different than any I had experienced before. Even though I had lost both of my parents. So my dad died when I was in my 30s and my mom in my 40s. So earlier than I had wanted, of course, but we all kind of expect, you kind of live your life understanding that at some point your parents are going to die. That's what's supposed to happen. That's not supposed to happen with your child. And there was something about that out of order death that just really brought a whole wave of grief, a tsunami, and symptoms and, all kinds of things that I hadn't been expecting. And I knew really early on that I didn't want, so often we hear stories of parents who've lost a child and that ended their life as well. They just kind of got stuck there and they never, and I hate the languaging. We have such awkward languaging around grief, but people say, they never recovered. I don't think grief is something you recover from. I think you integrate it and you carry it forward with you. But I knew that I was going to have to do something radically different than I had done or than I had expected to ever have to do to survive that death. So I realized very early on, I got this, realization, download, whatever, that my path was going to be being conscious and curious. And so what that meant was I couldn't go unconscious. I couldn't ignore any emotions, any thoughts, any feelings, anything. I just had to let it all be experienced. And the curiosity was really about trying to in the early days, the curiosity is about how to breathe, right? When you're curled up in a ball on the sofa sobbing and you can't get a breath. That was the early day curiosity. Now my curiosity is, as it's changed in the last 2.5 years, now it's really a lot about, how do we break down these stigmas around grief? How do we make grief something that we can talk about? Because if we talk about it and we share how it happens to us and how it works, then it's way less scary. It's less isolating. You feel less like you're going, like something's wrong with you. And it creates an opportunity for us all to connect with each other. So that's really become my mission now, is to just do everything I can to open up conversations, to help people support each other better, to help businesses be more grief friendly, for the staff and for the customers. There's so many businesses that I just couldn't even go into because it was so hard to be there for all kinds of different reasons, depending on the business. So that's really become now, my mission for the rest of my life, as I continue to grieve Ben and my parents and the other people I've lost, because I really don't think you get over it or through it or move on, right? We want to move with our loved ones. We want to carry them with us somehow. So as I do that and learn more about how to do that for me, it's become really important to share it as much as I can with other people so that they can open up conversations and we can start to have more conversations about how it really works and what's going on. And, especially right now, we're recording in April of 2023. We've all experienced 3 years of loss of people. Some people have lost multiple people, of our sense of normal, where we fit in the world. Somehow everybody was going on vacation that I know, we all lost a vacation. We lost the things that filled us up, right? We couldn't go to concerts or museums or sports or, whatever it was that we did together that, helped us feel connected and helped us feel ourselves. We lost so much of that and we're not talking about it. And that to me is really worrisome because I think grief stuffed eventually explodes somewhere, somehow. And, if you can experience it at the time, even though it's horrifyingly difficult, and I don't want to minimize that for people, especially if you're someone listening who's in that acute phase at the very, very beginning or in the early days, which for me was about 2 years. I had a real turning point around 2 years. But those first 2 years were brutal. So I don't want to minimize that for people. But for me, I had to accept the brutal. I had to accept the awful. I had to accept the messy and the horrifying and the disorienting and all of it, because otherwise it was just going to shatter me into pieces.
And that's powerful. And I want to talk about that turning point in later uh moments. But when I'm not a parent, so I'm gonna give that full disclosure. But I understand that losing a child is much more different and much more harder for any people for that matter. And some people experience grieving a different way. Some dealing it with a healthy way. Some of it's very unhealthy to say the least. Um, in your experience, with losing Ben, um, how was it for you? Can you put it into words? Because the reason I ask is some people who are dealing with grief sometimes blame themselves, sometimes they blame others.
Mhm.
So have you dealt with that experience, with that feeling?
Yeah, it's interesting because there is a lot of blame and sort of shame, I think, that people feel sometimes in grief. I didn't feel that.
That's great.
You know, uh, yeah, it's really interesting because I know, especially for parents, we're so trained to believe that we should be able to take care of our kids, that we should be able to keep them safe and all those kinds of things. And of course, we know on some level that the reality of that is that that's not true, right? It's impossible from their very tiniest days to, when they become adults. I don't have that much power, right? I can do everything I can do, but I can only do what I can do. So I didn't feel that, which I felt a lot of relief about. And I've done a lot of contemplation about, because it seems like almost a given that as a parent who loses a child, you're supposed to somehow feel that you have failed them, or you're supposed to somehow feel that there was something more you could do. And Ben struggled with mental health issues. He died of depression and anxiety. Um, and from when he started to have those issues at a very young age, we did everything we knew how to do. And it was really interesting. I had a great conversation with his psychologist after he had died. I had an opportunity to speak to her, and we hadn't spoken for years because she had worked with us when Ben was a teenager, and we had shifted when he got a little bit older. So we hadn't worked with her for a long time. And I said to her, it's so interesting because I don't feel guilty. Like, I don't feel like it was somehow my fault. I really feel like we did like I did everything I could to keep him here. Like, if loving him and caring about him and arranging the world in as much control that I had for him to be successful was enough, he would still be here. But it's not enough. It wasn't enough. And she said, no, like, you shouldn't feel any of that. You did everything that you could. So that was really validating for me to hear from her, because I knew it for myself. And I was really fortunate that I didn't have people in my life who said that to me, who said, "Oh, you're his mom. You should have protected him, or you should have been able to make him better," or whatever people's. And I don't know what people were thinking, but luckily they kept it to themselves, which is where most of those thoughts should stay. You should just not have those thoughts at all if you can manage. But if you're going to have them, you can keep them to yourself, because the griever doesn't need to hear what you think about, their role in their loved ones
Exactly.
passing, right? So I feel really fortunate I didn't feel that. And I know a lot of parents do. And that's a really, really hard place, to get kind of unstuck from, because even without that, it's absolutely overwhelming. Those early days where you're just bumping up against a reality that makes no sense over and over again. And, the cognitive dissonance, like your brain trying to make sense of this bizarre situation, all of that is enough. Like, I was a hot mess for a long time. And I think, had I had that sense of if only, or what if I had, or I should have, that would have made it far more complicated and far more difficult to navigate 100%.
What's your turning point in that stage? Because I understand that different people have like different timelines. Some others recovered, some others don't. Some people, that's the turning point of getting themselves into a dark mental state. Because
Yeah.
like you've mentioned earlier, some people, they can't keep that opinion to themselves. Now, the grieving parents, they gonna have that mentality that, oh, I should have known, oh, I should have done this, oh, I shouldn't listen to that person. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
can you tell us that turning point?
Yeah, I mean, I had a number of turning points. I think I was really fortunate, even in those earliest days, that I knew, I had that knowing that I had done everything I could, that, there was nothing, he knew we loved him, we knew he loved us. Like, there was nothing that felt undone in those areas, which I'm really grateful for. And it's so interesting because I watch parents now, and, as a parent, even when my kids were young, I was very careful about what battles I picked, because I thought, I don't want to be, you could fight with your kids over silly things perpetually. Like, you could do it their
Yep.
entire childhood. And I just thought, I don't want that to be our reality. I don't want to live in that kind of a home. And I see parents now. It's funny. I was standing in line at a store a few months ago now in the mall behind a mom and teenage daughter. And I don't know what had happened, and it's none of my business. But the mom was very angry with the teenage daughter, whatever she had done. And, teenage daughters are not always all that fun. I had one. She's now a lovely adult, but teenage daughters are not always that much fun. But all I could think in that moment was, like, what if that was your last conversation with your daughter?
And that's
Like,
terrible.
what if something happened and that's the last conversation you had with her? Like, would you be happy about that? And that really was how I tried to parent, even from when they were quite young. And of course, imperfectly, wildly imperfectly. But I really was conscious of thinking, like, is this that important? We used to talk about the 5 minute, 5 months, 5 years rule. Like, will you care in 5 minutes? Will you care in 5 months? Will you care in 5 years? Like, if you're going to take a stand for something, it needs to be something that's really important, that in 5 years, you're going to be really glad you took a stand for that thing. But if you're not going to care 5 hours from now, this is not a fight to have, right?
Yep.
So I really, was grateful that I felt that about my relationship with him. So I didn't feel a lot of, unresolved anything really. Um, and I think just because I'd had that sense that I really needed to hold on to curiosity and trying to understand grief as best I could and really become like a student of it, of my own experience. And I started in the very early days writing on Facebook. And the feedback I got from people was that it was really helping them to learn too. So somehow me getting the swirl out of my head so that I could have a little bit of peace was helping other people too. So that was a real turning point. And in that sense of, this awful thing happened and I'm not going to let it be for nothing. So I will do whatever I need to honor my grief, because that honors me, it honors Ben, it honors my daughter, my friends and family, for me to be honest about what's going on for me. And yes, that's awkward. And yes, that's uncomfortable. And yes, none of us want to do that, but that's the reality. So to be really clear about that. And then for me, those early days, we have this illusion that, something is supposed to happen after you've had a funeral or a celebration of life or whatever your tradition is, whatever the memorial event is, then that is supposed to release something. Something's supposed to shift and change. For sure, we acknowledge that all the firsts are going to be hard. And then something magical is supposed to happen at the 1 year mark. So for me, nothing magical happened at the 1 year mark at all. And in a way, the second year was almost harder, which is really common for grievers, I think, because we've been told the first year is going to be hard. And then something's going to shift and the second year is supposed to be better. So if you don't have that expectation that the second year can also be hard, then sometimes that's even worse, because you think, oh, this birthday of theirs is going to be better. But it's not. It's just as hard because they're still not here on their birthday and they're supposed to be getting a year older and they're not. So it's really stays complicated. So for me, where I feel like I shifted out of what I call early grief, and you get to set that timeline for yourself, was at the 2 year mark. So we were fortunate enough, my daughter and I, to have very understanding bosses, and we took that week off. Ben died 4 days before my daughter's birthday. So it's a super complicated week because it's his death anniversary and her birthday in the same week. So we took that week off and we went and we did a big trip. And we did a trip to a place that Ben really loved too, which I knew was going to be really hard. And I think having done that really hard thing in a way that was purposeful and intentional, and really, we've called these trips revisit and reclaim. That's because, we like to have names for things. So, when you revisit it to sort of acknowledge the importance the place has had and all of the things you have done there, for us with Ben, like that we've done there with our loved one. And then to make a decision about, what does this place now hold for us? Like, do we want it to be somewhere where we keep coming back to, or was it only important because of him? Well, no, it's a place we really love. So what do we do that we've always done? What do we do that's new? And there was something about surviving that week and actually really feeling some happiness and really feeling like we had done this really big thing without him, but he was still so present. He was still so there. That just gave me the permission to have another shift where it was like, okay, like, he's not going anywhere. Physically, he's not here anymore. He's not going to get any older. We don't get to have birthday parties with him. But on this trip to a place we all loved, he's absolutely there. So that was really freeing for me to just really feel a more grounded sense of being able to carry on with him, that he would always be with us somehow, even though he's not here the way we would like.
And that's powerful because not a lot of parents really, doing that. They're gonna, like, I'm not sure if everybody does this, but I understand that some parents do is they avoid going to those places because it
Yeah.
brings back memories that they're not really ready for it yet. Um that's that's very powerful of you doing that and your daughter doing that, because I understand it's very very difficult in an emotional standpoint.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think you're right. I think grievers generally, when it's a parent or, whoever you've lost, we tend to shy away from those
Mm-hmm.
places that were really special, that we shared special memories with them. But for us, so many of those places were places we really loved that we didn't want to not feel like we could go back to. So then it becomes about, okay, well, when? Because you can't, like, we couldn't have done that trip, say, the year before. The year before that, we did a smaller, like, we just basically ran away and hid. The first anniversary, we just ran away and hid, which was very healthy for us.
Yeah.
The two of us, we took lots of things with us that would remind us of him and really spent the week honoring him, but we didn't go anywhere difficult. So this trip, I think that's part of why it was such a turning point, because it was like I had a lot of anticipation of how hard it was going to be in a place that had been so important to all of us together. And it was as hard as I thought it was going to be. But we're very clear, and I'm very clear in knowing that I don't want to live a smaller life because this happened. I want to still live a big, expansive life. And I can do that with him with me. And I don't want to not be able to go places that we love, but I need to go there then intentionally and understanding that, you know, there's places here that are particularly tied to him. So do we do all of those this time? No, maybe not. Maybe we do some of them. You know, there's some things we had never done with him. So we did some of those things, which was really fun to be able to say, okay, well, if we're going to release some of the things we used to do, then we can add new things and we can explore this place that's precious to us in a new way as well. For me, it's all about the intentionality. It's about understanding that it's going to be hard and expecting it to be. There was a lot of tears shed that week and a lot of laughter too. But with the intention to go and revisit it, so to give it that place of honor that we feel tied to him, and then reclaim it as this place that we can go to without him physically here, but with the memories of him. Because to me, the memories are a great comfort. It means he was here.
Yep.
Right? It means he mattered to us. So for me to ignore and try and distance myself from the places where he's so present almost is harder.
Before.
But you have to be intentional for sure and careful and go in eyes wide open, right? It's eyes wide open courage. Going in knowing that it's going to be heartbreaking and wonderful and impossible and beautiful all at the same time.
And
that's kind of grief,
powerful.
right? You know, kind of how grief works. I said to my daughter in the very early days, you know, we're going to become experts at holding paradox.
Mm-hmm.
Because grief is all about paradox, right? It's like people are coming to visit it. Isn't it lovely to see everybody? But they're only here because somebody died, and that's horrible, right? It's like, it's this weird, right from the beginning, you know, you're holding horror and beauty at the same time. And you have to become masterful, you know, imperfect for sure. We didn't do any of this perfectly, and it's brutal and hard and painful. And it's our reality. So how do we make that something we can, you know, use for good and use for something other than just being terrible?
Before being a grief educator, um, do you before uh Ben passed, are you already a grief educator or after that one?
Yeah, I became a grief educator. I took that training after he had died. Before he died, I had just finished my transformational coaching training. So I was already on that path of, you know, what can I do next that would be of service and could help people? And that obviously all fell apart, you know, when he died and my entire world shattered into pieces. And then I really, you know, for me, it was so helpful to be able to talk about grief and to learn more about it and understand better what was happening to me, because all kinds of surprising things were happening to me that I hadn't expected or known about. You know, no one had told me about things like brain fog, where you just can't remember
Mm-hmm.
anything and you can't do multi-step things. And, you know, I had to think about showering. And I know that sounds so weird, but if you don't think about showering, because you just do it the same way every day, right? We all have kind of a routine. But I would stand in the shower and go, like, did I shampoo yet? And you're kind of going, I don't think so. Oh, except that might be conditioner. Did I like you're having to think through the whole thing and everything takes forever. Like there's so many things about grief that no one had told me. And so because I'm someone who's comfortable speaking and I needed to grieve out loud, I needed to talk about it, I needed to share with people what was happening for me. I did the grief educator training to broaden my knowledge base because everybody, as you said so brilliantly, right? Everybody grieves differently. And we grieve differently each time with each loss, it's a little bit different, right? I grieve differently for my dad than I did for my mom, than I am for Ben. And so I wanted a really solid foundation of knowledge and exposure and conversation with different grievers, right? To just really understand what's the commonalities, what's different, and it's so interesting, that kind of concept of like what's healthy and unhealthy. And that can mean so many different things for different people. So I really wanted that foundational training to just really feel grounded in my knowledge base as well as my experiential base, because my experience base was, pretty robust at this point. But I wanted to have that undergrounding of the knowledge and training as well.
And the reason I asked that, and I think some people might agree, that being a grief educator or being a life coach in general comes with a different package per se, because it's it's different when a life coach tells you to do this thing, but without even experiencing it. With you, like you've mentioned earlier with your daughter, you're gonna be like expert of this, like expert of paradox. And with that, what do you think that um might help you educate others, help others on that? Because not a lot of grief educator really, you know, experience this kind of thing, especially what you've experienced. And I think and I believe that experience is very invaluable to all of us. It's very important to teach the other generations, you know what I mean? So what lessons that you've get in your experience that you tried to pass on to the people who need it the most?
So what I try to encourage people to do as best you can, right? Because grief is complicated and it's hard and it's
Yep.
messy and you're going to do it imperfectly, and that's to be expected, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I really try to encourage people to do is ignore pretty much almost anything they've heard about how grief is supposed to work and talk to people who've really done it and share what's really true, right? I think so much of what happens with grief, because it's this taboo topic that we're so scared of and we don't want to talk about it, it almost feels like it's contagious somehow, even though we know logically that's not true, but we don't want to get too close to it because it's so uncomfortable. And for so many of us, big emotions are so uncomfortable, right? So if you're grieving, the best thing you can do is give yourself permission to grieve, because society doesn't really give us permission. Right? You probably maybe have 3 days off at work and then you're supposed to come back as your old self, which is impossible. Like it's just not even possible, right? People want you to get over it and move on, and they say all kinds of horrifying things because we don't talk about it. So that's the other thing is, the more that I can share about what happened to me and what I experienced means that a griever who hears about that, right? If someone just heard me talking about brain fog, for example, and no one had ever told them that before, that it's very common in grief to have this foggy brain that doesn't remember how to do simple things, that for me cannot read nonfiction. I have no comprehension. Like it's just still not back 2.5 years later. It's a struggle. I can read really simple nonfiction, but anything dense, almost impossible. Multi-step processes are super hard. So if you've heard someone talking about that and saying that that's normal and to be expected, then when it happens to you, it's not so scary and it's not so isolating. And you don't feel so much like you shouldn't tell anybody because they might think something's wrong with you, because you kind of think something's wrong with you, right? So if we can talk about things like brain fog, sleep disturbance, digestive disturbance, tingling in the extremities is one that I didn't have, but people have talked about on a number of grief forums that I've been on, and a number of conversations I've had with other grievers. There's so many physical symptoms, physical pain, like people get physical pain in their body that, we don't talk about grief. So we don't talk about how it really happens and what really happens to us. So if we could start to have those kinds of conversations, then when grief comes, we don't feel so much like there's something wrong with us. Because that's part of what happens. We get isolated because our friends and family don't know what to say or do. And they're scared that they don't want to do the wrong thing. They don't want to make it worse, but they know they can't fix it. So you're already isolated because people kind of back away because they're scared. And then all these weird things start happening to you that you didn't know were coming. So now you kind of don't want to say anything because there might be something more wrong with you than you thought. So it kind of builds this whole cycle of isolation and distance, when really, if we could talk about it, we could build connection instead. So that's what I do to try and help grievers, is just talk about how it really works, how, there are some, every time it's unique, and there are some commonalities that are likely going to come up at some point, or maybe not. But if they do, to not feel like there's something wrong with you is really important, and to just give yourself that permission to feel all the feelings, right? Which most of us, we do not have, we're not really good at that yet, right? We're getting better. We've been talking about emotional intelligence and things like that for a good decade now, right? So we're getting better at it. But when the emotions are big, and the emotions are mostly from like the negative emotion list, if you buy into that paradigm of sort of positive and negative emotions, which I find hugely problematic as a griever, because almost everything you're feeling is on the negative side, and none of us want to be negative or bad, right? So it creates a whole weird spin in your head. But you're feeling all these negative, big emotions, and you're scared and you're isolated. And I don't think it needs to be that way, because if you've heard me talk about what happened to me, and then maybe you've also heard someone else talk about what happened to them, and you can hear some of the things that are happening to you in those other people, then it's just normal. It's something we don't talk about. It's something we don't really acknowledge, but it's still normal. So that to me is the biggest message for grievers, is whatever you're feeling, whatever you're experiencing, you're not alone. Someone has felt it and experienced before you. They probably didn't talk about it because they probably felt scared to share what was going on for them. But you're not alone. And what's happening to you isn't weird or strange. It's grief. And we need to talk about it.
And that's powerful. And I want to talk about, I hope that this isn't like too personal, but in the podcast, we talk a lot about mental health. And
Mhm.
we're talking about mental health in the side of the person, or to a child, or to a teenager, young adult, but not in a parent standpoint. So I hope this isn't too personal, but when Ben, or when you notice that Ben isn't the person he is before uh his depression and anxiety, um as a parent, what does it, like, how do you know in the first place? Because the reason I ask is, when a child opens up that, mom, dad, I have a depression, the instinct of the parents is they gonna shrug it off, or they gonna, the parents themselves gonna overthink that, should have known this, why are you
Mhm.
dealing with this? And some parents, um they're the reason sometimes, um they're the reason why their children is having this depression. I think maybe because the way they parent their child, that sort of thing. Um, with you, when Ben opens up, or when you know that Ben has a depression, as a parent, what can you do, like, to help? And the reason I ask is a lot of parents are dealing with this but don't know how to handle it. And I think it can help them along the way.
Yeah, it's so hard. It's really hard because, I think we still have a lot of stigmas around mental health. They're changing for sure. In my generation, it's much more, there's much more stigma than like in my kids' generation. They're much more open to talking about what's happening with their mental health, which I think is really healthy. Because again, then you feel less alone, right? The
Mm-hmm.
more we talk about what's real for us, the less we feel isolated and like there's something wrong with us, right? For me, we accessed resources as best we could. Ben had professional help. Um, we had a whole language that we used around how he was feeling because you could sort of see signs sometimes that he was struggling more than others. And most of the time, Ben was very high functioning, right? He held down a full-time job, he had lots of friends, he had a rich, full life, and he had this mental illness. Um, I think for the parents, it's really important to understand, what you can control and what you can't. And it's really hard to let go what you can't because as parents, all we want is for our children to be okay, right? We just want them to be okay. And when they're struggling, it's really, really hard. You know, um, we kept, one of the things for Ben that made things easier sometimes if he was getting overwhelmed or he was starting to struggle was to just take things off the plate. So we would just say, okay, like what needs to stay? What can we let go of? That was one of our coping strategies. Um, we always talked about, I was always very conscious of having like fun things on the agenda, if that makes sense. So there were things to look forward to. And that's part of, I think, how COVID contributed for Ben was that all those things went away, right?
Exactly.
So the sense of like, we have this vacation to look forward to, we have these concert tickets to look forward to, we have this thing coming up with friends and family to look forward to. All of those things went away. And I think too, for Ben, if you think about what the world was like in the summer and fall of 2020, it was a pretty horrifying place, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were wildfires globally, right? So the world is literally on fire. George Floyd had been murdered, so we're watching the aftermath of that with all the, I feel like, rightful protests about injustice and the way that the world works. And, and then the backlash against those. And we were just really seeing so much of what we were seeing was like humanity at its worst, writ
Exactly.
large.
Yeah.
And for Ben, that really weighed on him heavily, right? He really understood the world in a way where he could see connections and make distinctions that many of us miss. And I think that that was really hard for him to watch, people attacking each other and people being so hateful and people, as the environment is in a catastrophe and we have this global pandemic and people are dying like right, left, and center, and people are so sick and the hospitals are overwhelmed. And, it was a very, very difficult time for everyone. And so I think for people that were already struggling with mental illness, that just made it even harder. Um, so, I think what I would say to parents is access the professional help that you can, be relentless in your pursuit of help, and find people who, there's so much new research about mental health and how, there's so much great research around trauma and its links to mental health. Dr. Gabor Mate is a fantastic, he happens to be from where I'm from as well, and I've followed his work for decades. I discovered him when he was doing parenting stuff, and now he's, transitioned from that through working with addiction, and now he's written some amazing books about trauma. And really understanding how that childhood trauma adds up. Like we have such a better sense now of how those childhood traumas add up and don't need to be big. I think one of the misconceptions we had about trauma is it has to be these big, horrifying, newsworthy things. But trauma is a wound. So if you have a wound that's not healed, that doesn't get healed, that's trauma. And that
Mm-hmm.
stays with you. And it's in your body and it impacts how your brain works. And I think if you can find someone that's on the cutting edge of that trauma work, I often, because I'm also very connected in trying to read as much and learn as much as I can about those kinds of things, because that all impacts grief as well. Because one of the things that happens in grief is all your old wounds come up, right? Everything that you have not yet healed comes back. You're at your most devastated, and here comes everything else too. So I'm really fascinated in all this cutting, this newer research about trauma and how it works, and the intersection of grief and trauma and how those inform each other. So I would say to parents who have kids that are struggling, seek out people on the front lines of that, on the cutting edge of that. Let's see that there's something to be done other than medication. Not that medication is bad. It serves many, many people, but it's imperfect. And there's so much we can do that we're learning so much more now about how to heal trauma and how to heal these kinds of things. And really to also just acknowledge that, right now we're living in a deeply dysfunctional society. It's deeply dysfunctional. And so your response to that may just be healthy. Like you might be having a healthy response to an unhealthy system. But as long as we're pretending that the system is healthy, then the person is unhealthy. But I actually think it's the other way around, right? I think if you're not worried about what's happening around us right now, that's very unhealthy. Because if we're watching, the world's pretty dysfunctional right now. And so that's the other thing to maybe be having a conversation with kids about is, yeah, there's some big problems right now in the world because they see it. So we don't do them a service by ignoring it. So maybe having some of those kinds of conversations is helpful to just acknowledge, right? So much about it is allowing people to be seen and heard, right? That's what kids need the most. They need to be seen and heard. So I grew up in a generation where you were supposed to sit quietly and be neither of those things, right? Because I'm in my mid 50s. So my upbringing was a lot about like, yes, there were times, and I had a really great family and we had lots of rich conversations, but a lot of my friends were like, you were supposed to sit silently at the dinner table and you were to be seen and not heard. Like there was no space to feel like you were supposed to be actively seen and heard. And that's what kids really need. So see them, hear them, allow what they're saying to be believable, believe them when they tell you things, and just listen without necessarily trying to jump in and fix it. Because especially as parents, man, that instinct to fix it and make it all better, it is strong. And that made a lot of sense when we were like trying to protect ourselves from a saber-toothed tiger.
Mm-hmm.
We're not doing that anymore, but we're still living like the threats we face are saber-toothed tigers. And they're not. So we can release some of that and have conversations about what's really happening.
You've talked about the control. Like, not a lot of parents really know this because when their child opens up, they want to control everything. I know their intention is great. Their intention is
Yep.
I wanna help my child, but having too much control and not knowing when to let go sometimes deteriorate that help, and they don't even
Yeah.
realize it. When Ben uh opens to you about mental health, um what steps did you guys take to say, okay, we're gonna help you deal with this, we're gonna do this and that? What are your steps?
So he, when he was really struggling, we would just, as I said, like we would take as many things off his plate as we could, right? Because when you're really struggling with depression and anxiety, and this was one of the things that was really interesting to me in those early acute days of grief, was I almost felt like I was getting a glimpse at what life had been like for him,
Oh
right?
wow,
Because
that's
everything feels
powerful.
heavy, right? Everything feels heavy. Everything is hard to do. Everything feels dark. And the difference was I knew that that was temporary, right? Because that's grief and that's early grief. And that was going to shift over time. And one of the things that happens when you have poor mental health is that you get spinning thoughts that tell you that it's never going to change. That what
Exactly.
is real in this moment is never going to change. So that was the big difference for me. I knew it was going to change, but it was really interesting. And I'll never forget thinking, oh my gosh, like, I wonder if this is what it felt like to be Ben, where everything, it's like you're having to go like push through molasses to do anything. Like everything takes so much effort. Everything is so hard. So if there are things you can do to make their life easier, do them. Because who cares, right? In the grand scheme of things, if you put away their dish or tidy the bathroom or clean their room, it doesn't matter, right? That's back to that 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 months, 5 years. 5 years from now, I'm not going to care that I cleaned the bathroom. Who cares? Doesn't matter. But we get so caught up as parents in like, we want our kids to be successful. We want them to be good humans, which are all great things. We should want that for our kids. How we get there sometimes is a little bit
Exactly.
less free than it could
Yeah.
be, right? And I say that absolutely with no blame or judgment, right? Every parent on the planet is doing the best they know how in any given moment. And I really believe that. I really believe humans are doing the best they know how. And, part of why we're here is to learn how to do better.
Exactly.
So, keeping that space to learn and read and find out things and learn new theories and all of that, so much has changed since, Kathleen's 28 this year. Ben would be 25 in 2 weeks. He would have been 25 at the end of this month. So a lot's changed in that time about how we parent kids. And there's so much great parenting, where you're really building in them from a very young age, them having a voice, them being heard, all their big emotions being okay,
Mm-hmm.
right? Not saying to your angry toddler, stop being angry. Like, you should know, like, we need to say, oh, I can see that you're angry. And then teach them how to process that and be, it's okay to be angry. Angry is healthy. It's not healthy to lash out. It's not healthy to kick people. It's not, all the things that toddlers do because they can't really regulate yet. But then we get to teach them those things.
Mm-hmm.
So, really seen and heard. They need to be seen and heard.
I want to ask, um, did Ben open up or you just notice it?
Yes and yes. Sometimes he would say something. More often, I would just notice. So I think that everybody has tells. If you kind of go to a poker language, right? Everybody has a tell for when they're struggling. So, I'm sure I know what mine is. Mine is clutter. So when my entire dining room table is covered with stuff because I haven't managed to put anything away, right? That's a sign that I'm in some version of overwhelm, right? I'm just looking around going, how am I doing? Oh, I'm actually doing okay. There's like the table is not completely covered. So Ben had some tells that I would watch for. I think really common ones are around cleanliness, around being able to put things away, like things that take some capacity to do that mostly only impact yourself would be the things I would say to watch out for. Um, because most people will put on a good front because they don't want to be a bother. They don't necessarily want people to know they're struggling. They often believe that they're supposed to be able to fix it themselves. So I would kind of watch for particular signs with Ben. And sometimes he would say, oh, I'm really struggling. And then we would have a talk about it and say, okay, like what are you struggling with? Is there anything I can do to help? Mostly he just needed to be heard, right? He didn't need me to fix anything. Um, or he would say, it would really help me if you would do blah, blah, blah. Or maybe it was something I was doing that was bugging him and that was just pushing him over capacity. So he can have that conversation with me, maybe in a different way than he could with a coworker, right? So you kind of have to put
Yep.
up with the annoying things your coworker does. But we had the kind of relationship where he could come to me and say, this way that you do whatever it is really bugs me. So we need to figure out a different way so that I'm not, activated by what you're doing. And we would have those kinds of conversations. And I would be able to have them with them too, right? That was a two-way street because he would do things that bugged me equally. And I would be
Yeah.
able to say, okay, that thing you're doing, we lived together as adults, right? He was 22 when he died. I'm an old lady. right? So we had to make that transition to being, yes, parent and child, but really we're two adults who happen to be parent and child trying to navigate, living together as adults, which is also tricky and challenging and
Yeah.
so fun.
um, the reason I ask, um, not a lot of parents really understand it or really uh know it, because knocking on wood, but when they're when they're when they see their child, you know, um commit suicide, or they see that they do harm to themselves, the opening statement or the opening words that most parents do is, I did not know, I didn't know, or I
Yeah.
have no idea. And that's very difficult as a child, or as a son, because all all kids just want to be heard, to be listened by the parents. And some parents, sometimes their instinct goes to, let's fix this, or I'm gonna fix this,
Mhm.
without realizing that we can fix it. We just want you to be there for us, just to listen. And
Mhm.
I think that's very, you know, kind of lost in a way, because here in the Philippines, we still have the stigma about mental health, about depression, anxiety.
Mhm.
And the worst part is, I'm gonna tell you a story that when a child opens up about, mom, dad, I have a depression, I have anxiety, the first words that the parents gonna tell them is, oh, that's just a phase. You're just sad. Oh, you're just stressed. And as a child, when you try to open up with your parents, like, it's very discouraging when you hear those things, because you just want to be heard.
Yeah.
Um, what are I think the best way to ask this is, what are the best advice that you can give, that when a parents approach you and says, um my child open up about his depression or her depression, what should I do, or how should I deal with this? I think I've said this to that okay? You know what I mean? What are the best advice for that?
I think it comes back again to seen and heard, right? Acknowledge that what they're feeling is real
Exactly.
because it's real for them. So whether you believe
Mm-mm.
in it or not, it actually doesn't matter, right? If you think it's a phase or you think they're going to outgrow it or whatever you think, that actually doesn't matter. They need to understand that you hear them and that you know that it's real. Um, and then really like find professional help. Find professional help. If they have come to you, that's because they want support. And you don't necessarily have the skill set. I didn't have the skill set, when Ben was 10 to support him through that. I didn't. So I had to learn and we had to work with professionals and we had to keep trying different things. And I think, you know, there's there's so much trauma happening right now. Like really we're all traumatized right now. Even if you were
Exactly.
perfectly healthy, which
Yeah.
really none of us were 3 years ago. If we're being honest with ourselves, none of us are
Yeah.
perfectly healthy. But right now we're all really traumatized. We're all carrying a lot of trauma from the last 3 years. So find someone who's trauma informed, right? There's a whole different way and you could do some reading about that too. Like if you're a parent whose child has come to you, I absolutely believe that what's happening with the mental health crisis in our young people is related to trauma. There's no question. I think some of it's biological, for sure. There's a biological component, but we're finding, the scientists, because I'm not one of those. I'm a mom and a grief educator, right? The scientists are finding more and more that what's going on is related to trauma. So if you can find someone that can look at that aspect of what's happening And really, the more you can be the safe place to come home to, like, I just knew that my job in Ben's life was to be his safe place to come home to. It was hard enough
That's
for him to
powerful.
navigate the rest of the world. I didn't need to be a hard place to navigate. I needed to be a safe harbor. So whatever you need to do so that you can be the safe harbor, that's critical for your child. Because the world out there is big and scary and full of trauma and bullies and, it's a mess right now, right? We all can see that. So if you're that safe harbor and they know they have a safe place to come home to, where they're seen and heard, they're not judged, right? And that's all. And I, it's easy for me to say that. I get how hard it is to do because I did it for as long as I was able, and I will continue to do it for my daughter and friends and, for everybody, because I think that's what we all need. But especially if you have a child who's come to you to say they're struggling and, they're hearing about this, they're hearing about depression and anxiety and they feel that too. They have those feelings. You can't minimize it. You have to accept that it's real for them, even if you don't understand it. We can all educate ourselves, right? This is the Google Chat GPT era. Go on to Google or, some AI, Chat GPT is scary smart in some ways, huge blind spots, right? But scary smart in some ways. And you can educate yourself. We have no lack of information,
Exactly.
right? What we have a lack of is application, is understanding how to apply the information that we have. So educate yourself, right? There's no reason to not be educating yourself, even if your child's not coming to say,
Mm-hmm.
maybe their friend is. Maybe you're that safe harbor for their friend. Maybe you're that safe harbor for, you know, their friend's friend. Like, who knows? You never know who you're going to touch and who you're going to encounter. But we all need to be educating ourselves right now about trauma, about grief, about loss. We're all in it together and we're all feeling it. And, really, we need to be learning as much as we can about how to support each other. And that's, to kind of full circle all the way back, that's really what I'm about now. Like, how can we talk about it? How could you have a conversation around the table with friends or family and say, you know, I think we're all grieving. I think we're all feeling grief. I think we're all feeling big emotions. Let's talk about, what have we lost in the last 3 years? And maybe it's people. So many of us lost people or multiple people, like there's families where they lost, half their family. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I have one friend who started keeping a list of, so 2 degrees of separation. So people she knew and people she knew who had died of COVID. She stopped writing that list after 4 pages. Four
Wow.
pages. People lost a lot of people. So even if that's not the reality for you, you lost all kinds of other things. People lost businesses, people lost jobs, people lost graduations or ceremonies or their ability to get together. They lost their sense of how the world works. We lost a lot of things. What if you had that conversation on the dinner table one night, if you're a family that sits down to the dinner table, or in the car? We used to have our best conversations, our most dreaded, but really rich conversations in the car, because you're all strapped in, you're all stuck there till you get where you're going, and nobody has to make eye contact, right? So the kids could
Yep.
roll their eyes all they wanted in the back seat, and I just didn't look, right? And we could have these conversations about hard things. Because if we're talking about it, if we understand we're not the only one, right? If we understand that this is normal and we're actually all feeling it, it's healthy for us as a collective. It's healthy for us as a family. It's healthy for us as a group of friends to know that we're not alone.
And that's powerful. Um, during those times, have you got into a mindset that it's your fault? Because I know people when their partner or their uh child opens up about mental health, about they're having a episode of depression, anxiety, sometimes in the fault they blame themselves even though they didn't do anything wrong, but their instant thought is, I should have done more. I should have done better. I should have know this. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
how did you deal with that if you experience those kind of things? And how can we help people um separate from that mindset? Because it's very difficult. It's very very difficult for, seeing those people that that starting to, you know blaming themselves.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to be really honest with ourselves. And if we've done something that's created trauma, then we need to help heal that. Right. Um, and I think we also have to be honest about if we haven't. Right. And and for me, for a long, long time, I had decided, like when I had my daughter, so my daughter's older than Ben, obviously, if she's 28 and he would be 25. Um, when I had her, I realized that I needed to become the kind of person that could be the best mom to her as I knew how to be. And so that was a really big mindset shift for me that, ultimately I was quite responsible for this little human and she deserved me to be the best that I could be, which also meant that I had to give myself a lot of grace for when I learned something new and realized that I hadn't been doing that, right? And that happens a lot in grief too when I'm working with people who are supporting someone who's grieving. And so we're working through all those skills and mindsets that help us to show up for someone. Then, of course, you start to look at all the times that you didn't do it the way that you know now, but we didn't know then, right? So if you're really conscious of doing the best that you know how in the moment, that gives you a lot of grace later when you learn new things or you learn a new way of being. And then you can pivot to that new way and think, wow, like I have curiosity about that, right? Are there things I could have done when he was way younger? Probably, but I didn't know then what I know now. And if I didn't know, I couldn't have done it. It's not possible, right? On an
Mm-hmm.
intellectual level and on an emotional level too. Like if I didn't know, for example, like was very traumatized in school. He was really bullied by kids, teachers, and administration, all levels of everybody. And I didn't know a lot of that. He kept a lot of that from me. So I could go down the guilt path and think, oh, somehow I should have known, but that's not reality. Because if he's not going to tell me, and if no one tells me, how am I supposed to know?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I think we do ourselves a disservice when we get all kind of tangled up in shame, because you can't, if you're in shame, you can't learn, right? And so for me, my approach always is, how do I get out of this fixed mindset into a growth mindset? Well, if I'm in shame, I'm fixed. You can't feel shame and learn at the same time. We're not wired that way. So you have to release the shame. And if you really were doing the best you knew how, which I think we all are, then that has to be good enough. And when that's that old wonderful Maya Angelou quote, right? When we know better, we do better. So be constantly learning, be educating yourself, be reading new research, be, curious about how the world really works, be having conversations. And when you know better, do better.
And having a conversation like that, it's very helpful in a way that you
Hmm.
can um relieve yourself. Because when you kept, I think that's the problem of during the pandemic, because we're isolated. Like the only thing that you're you're with you is your your thoughts. And sometimes that's very um difficult to address, or even to have a mental state, or having that stable mental state. Because when you
Yeah.
started to deal with your problems on yourself, sometimes it becomes so overwhelmed that it eats you alive. And having
Yes.
this kind of conversation really helps you relieve it.
Yes. 100%. 100%. And that to me is part of what's so interesting about working in grief, because everything I've learned about grief is related to learning about everything,
Mm-hmm.
right? The way we allow ourselves to feel our emotions impacts everything. That impacts all aspects of our life, not just grief, right? The way that we can show up to really support each other, the way that I would want to show up for someone else is how I first need to show up for myself, right? The way that I want to talk to someone else is the way I first need to talk to myself. So when we're feeling isolated and then we get into that spin, that's part of why I started writing, because I could just feel these thoughts spinning, spinning, spinning. I thought,
Mm-hmm.
I cannot keep thinking that same thing. I need to get it out somehow. And for me, getting it out looked like writing. You have to get it out somehow, because otherwise we get into that spin. And if we're isolated and spinning, we're just, we're creating that path in the brain even stronger. And there's nothing disrupting it, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
that brain plasticity concept doesn't work if you're just thinking the same thoughts over and over again, right? You're just entrenching those connections. So yeah, and I think, there's so much interesting, quote unquote support for people who are, having mental health issues or poor mental wellness. And so much of it is about, reach out, stay connected with people, all these kinds of things. Ben did all of that. Even in COVID, he had really robust connections with his friends. They had figured out how his D&D group had figured out how to play D&D online. Like, they were really connected. He still was really connected.
Yeah.
Sometimes, those lists of like podcast hosts ask me sometimes, like, what would you say to a parent? Like, what are the things you should be watching for?
You can't.
I don't know. Those lists make me so angry because Ben did not demonstrate any of the things on the
Yeah.
list. Here's the 10 things to look for. He didn't demonstrate any of them.
Also, I think what you feel is valid, because a lot of parents didn't notice that, because their child didn't get onto that, list. He doesn't
Mm,
demonstrate that.
yeah.
Um, and that's dangerous if your child, or if you're high functioning uh depression, if you have high functioning depression, because you can function as a normal human being without
Yeah.
demonstrating those things, but when that shit hits you, it's really hard to overcome. Even though I've kept this quote in my mind that this too shall pass, but when I
Yeah.
have this depression episode, oh my god, it's very difficult to hold on, because
Yeah.
sometimes this too shall pass. Sometimes my brain is saying, "No, you won't. You're stuck in this problem, Bren."
Yeah. And that voice is really loud,
Very hard,
right?
very
The
loud.
voice that says you're stuck here, it's never going to change, is much louder than the one that's kind of quietly going, no, this too shall pass. Like,
Exactly.
this too shall pass. And so to me, what I found with grief, which was the closest I've come, I think, to understanding how Ben felt, is that sense of needing to stay really in the moment, right? Like one of my mantras became like, in this moment, I'm safe. Like in this moment, I am safe. In this moment, I'm okay. I can't predict the next one. I have to let go of the last one. In this moment, I'm okay. And I'm just going to hold on to this moment. I don't know what the next one's going to be, but this
Mhm.
one's okay. And then you get back in that spin of the story and the emotions and all of the overwhelm, the tsunami, right? That's coming at you and you're just spinning underwater and you can't breathe. And then, you gasp that breath of air and go, nope, like in this moment, I'm okay. In this moment, I'm okay. And I mean, there's some amazing research around depression and anxiety and things like tapping. Have you ever heard of tapping?
No.
Okay. So when we get off, you're gonna go to Google University and learn about
Mm-hmm.
tapping, and you'll think it's really weird and woo woo, and it doesn't make any sense, but it's actually really super effective and fascinating. What tapping does is you tap on meridian lines. So it's linked to the meridian lines that are used for acupuncture and ancient Chinese medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And what it does is it helps actually rewire your brain. Like the science behind it is super cool. You
Oh,
feel a
wow.
little bit loopy when you're doing it because it's like you're tapping here and you're tapping here, and you're banging on yourself. So you will feel completely ridiculous doing it. I'm going to suggest you try it anyway.
Will do.
So there's things like that you can be doing, right? But I'm with you when you're in the depths. So, with Ben, we had language about it being the pit. So I would say, like, how are you doing in relation to the pit? Like, are you standing on the edge and you're looking into the pit? Are you hanging on to the top of the ledge by your fingertips, but you're hanging down into it? Or are you standing at the bottom, right? That was kind of how we would measure where his depression was. If you're at the bottom of that pit, man, that voice is loud.
So loud,
And the little
especially at
voice
night.
that's saying this too shall pass, or saying, oh, go tap, or like it's all well and good for me to say, oh, there's
Mm-hmm.
these great techniques. When you are in a depressive episode, when you're in the depths of it, it's brutal. It's brutal.
When a parents approach you, like, Suzanne, how can I uh deal with this? How can I uh express myself on this? Um, what do you usually do or to assess the person? Because when when a person approach you, they're in a different uh pace, they're in a different situation. Some
Mhm.
people are on the edge, some people are in the pit. So
Yeah.
how can we assess those people? And the reason I ask is when they started to realize that, oh my god, I need help, they don't know how to begin, they don't know how to start the process. And I just want to give the audience just a light on, this is a process, so that you can, start seeking help.
Yeah. So, what I would say to someone who has depression or anxiety, like if you have a mental health challenge, you need to find professional help. You need to find a therapist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist. You do not need a life coach, right? A life coach is not skilled enough in that area.
No, when
And
I
most,
think in terms of dealing with grief, because
yeah, yeah. And I just want to make sure we
okay,
make that segue
okay,
really clear,
all
right?
right, all
So
right,
if we're still talking about mental health, you're not going to go to a life coach,
all right.
right? If someone's coming to me dealing with grief, which is very similar, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
are you? And so with grief, there's so many analogies, but I love water analogies the best. So what I try to assess is, where are you? Are you still, so for me, the early days, the best way I can explain it is it's like being under a tsunami. So the wave has come, you are just swirling in the water, you don't know which way is up, the undertow has got you, you are like underwater, you can barely breathe. So are you there? That next realization for me was that actually I was not like a piece of driftwood or a rock or whatever. I was a cork. And every once in a while, I would bob to the surface like corks do because they float,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you get to the surface, grab a breath, and then the next wave comes and you're down under again. But because it's happened before, that you will get to the surface, right? Are you a cork? Next comes, like for me, so this is kind of how I make sense of the sort of how it progresses. Next for me was like a rowboat. My entire life, I have been a terrible rower. I could not row a rowboat to get anywhere on purpose ever. Useless.
Oh, I feel you.
Not one of my skills.
I feel you.
Right. And at the beginning, when I finally felt like I was a robot, I was actually like on the surface of the water most of the time, right? There's still waves that come and swamp the boat, and then you're back underneath and you have to like, get the water out and upright the boat and get back in. I didn't even have oars. So never mind that I was a terrible oarsman, I didn't even have oars. So you're on the surface of the water, but you're still completely subjected to its whims, right? The emotions still come when you can't predict. You don't know how far apart they're going to be, but you're at least floating most of the time. Or are you actually in like a proper boat? So it's all about like, how far apart are the waves, right? The waves still come. I mean, I cried this morning, right? The waves still come, but they're further apart. They're sometimes predictable, not always, right? Still something will happen and I'll be like, oh, there we are again, right? Why, how, what was the activator, what happened? So the waves still come, but for the most part, I'm safely in a boat. And then it becomes about, what is your life now? So what is your life going to be next? Because the life you knew before your person died doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to get back there is futile. There's only forward. So what is your life going to be now? So depending on which of those places people are at, we would have different conversations. Because when you're under the water in the tsunami, for me, it's about permission, right? You have to give yourself permission for that to be acceptable. Even though it's terrifying and it's awful and you're disoriented and half the time you're upside down, you have to accept that. That's the reality, right? So that's the conversation at that stage. If you know you're a cork, then it becomes about, okay, well, is there any pattern to what gives you buoyancy? Is there anything that makes you more buoyant than anything else? Then can we focus on that, right? If you're in the rowboat, then it's about, okay, so you're feeling a little more control, slightly, right? The waves still come, but you can at least, what's that called? I lose words. This is part of brain fog. This is brain fog in action. What's it called when you scoop the water out of the boat?
I have no clue. Bye
There's
bye.
a word for it. And someone at home is yelling at their radio, right? At their computer going, it's this, whatever it's called when you're scooping the water out of the boat,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you're trying to integrate new skills, you're learning, and then it becomes about, okay, so what's the next thing? What are the things that are still really hard? Where is your support? How's your relationship with yourself? How's your relationship with others? How's your relationship with life, right? The universe, God, spirit, whatever you call it, your relationship with life. And then we're starting to build those skills, right? We're looking at, where are the gaps? Where are the skills you need to build? What's the next logical thing for you to try and do? What's the
Mm-hmm.
next baby step? And I'm all about baby steps to success. There is no big striding in grief. It's all baby steps. So what's the baby step you could take today that maybe you couldn't take last week,
Mm-hmm.
right? What's the thing you can try today that maybe you couldn't do last week? And you're starting to try and build some capacity back. And that happens quite naturally, but there's also things you can do intentionally. If you can embrace this idea of being conscious and curious, there's things that you can do on purpose to help with that process. There's that old saying that, time heals all wounds, which I think is malarkey. It's just not actually true. What time gives you is time to do really hard work to heal the wounds,
Mm-hmm.
right? None of it happens by magic. It
Exactly.
happens from hard work.
Yeah.
So it is just embracing that it's going to be hard. And, bless Glennon Doyle, we can do hard things. And we just do hard things, one step at a time, one baby step at a time, finding your path, finding your way, figuring out what buoys you up and what weighs you down, and trying to release some of what weighs you down and grasp harder. Expose yourself. Grasping harder doesn't sound very healthy. I don't like that language, but embracing more of the things that buoy you up and doing that consciously, being curious. Like, here I am under this tsunami again. What happened? Today, Ben's birthday is 2 weeks from now, so I'm very attuned to birthdays. I'm scrolling Facebook this morning, as you do, because we're all addicted to our phones. So I'm
Yeah.
scrolling Facebook, and one of my Facebook friends, it was her son's 21st birthday today. Well, that was enough. I was off, because I have such vivid memories of Ben's 21st birthday. That was the last birthday he had before COVID, because he had his 22nd birthday during COVID. So of course it was not a normal birthday. So that was enough. So it's about, oh, here I am. I'm back under the wave. Why? Oh, birthdays. It's almost Ben's birthday. Here's this, full of promise, hopeful young man, which Ben was. And now he's not going to turn 25. It makes perfect sense that activated a bunch of emotions for me. But if we don't want to even acknowledge that the emotions happened, then we can never get to what's the activator, like what's the thing that kind of brought them up or made them more present, because the grief is there all the time, but there's things that make it, that push it to the fore. So it's about that sort of sense of, what was that about? Where did that come from? And you can't do that if you're still in the tsunami. You can't do that. You can start to do that when you get to the rowboat, but if you're still in the tsunami, then being conscious and curious is about, how do I get through today? How do I breathe? How do I feed myself? How do I get an appropriate amount of sleep? How do I move my body? How do I drink water? Very basic things. That's the curiosity in those early days. But as you move on and the grief starts to shift, then you can start to be curious about different things.
When Ben passed away, and I think a lot of people deal with it a different way, but when you heard, or when you heard or witnessed Ben passed away, what was your initial thought? Because the reason I ask this, um, some people that I know, that when they see a, I don't know, notice, I don't know, but like, notice that their loved one passed away, th- you can see in their face that they're turning white, like they're in shock. Like, at the same time, you're gonna see that all of that emotion just went out of the roof, and some people really broke down. So
Mhm.
when that happens, what was your initial thought?
I don't even know if I had thoughts, to be
No,
honest.
I mean, that's what I mean, because
Um,
when people
yeah, I don't even know
experience
if I
that,
did.
yeah,
Like, it's overwhelming. I think that's what I remember the most from those very earliest days, is how overwhelming it is. It's overwhelming. It makes no sense. And even when it's not an out of order death, I think when it's an out of order death, that surrealness is maybe heightened. But no matter who it is, when you first hear that someone has died, that sense of unrealness, and how is this true? Like, this doesn't even make sense. This doesn't, you're, again, you're just crashing again and again into
mm-hmm,
this reality that feels so unreal. Um, I think overwhelm is huge. That sense of this overwhelming thing that you can't make sense of. We're sense making creatures. That's what we do. That's why we share stories, right? It helps us to make sense of the world. If you think about sort of ancient, so many of the ancient wisdoms and the wonderful myths and stories, they're all about making sense of the world, right? This idea that, the planets are whatever, those ancient stories about them, and making, constellations out of stars to make a story about what that is. It's beautiful the way we make story to make sense of things, but there's no story that makes sense of it. So you're disoriented. I was disoriented. Um, and you have to do really hard things, right? You crash again and again into, having to phone to close accounts, having to tell strangers, having to tell friends and family. Like, those very earliest days are just, they're almost impossible. They're almost impossible. Like, because I've done it, I know it's possible, but it sure feels impossible at the time. And I think it's important that we normalize that for people, that the emotions are gigantic, the thoughts are scattered, and your ability to make sense of reality is non-existent because it
yeah.
doesn't make sense.
So before we end this, um, I know people that, um, I don't wanna, how can I put this in a way that they won't take offense of this, but I know someone that they just lost their son um because of cancer. Um and I think the, the way I want to ask this is when they're dealing grief because uh their loved one lost a battle to cancer. um how how can they deal with it with the acceptance of he lost to cancer, because it's I understand it's a long grueling process, and sometimes a- and sometimes they somewhat know it already, but it's
Mhm.
still very difficult for them to process. So how can we help them? How can we help those people who in the back of their mind they know that this going to happen, but still it's very difficult to accept it.
Yeah, it's such an interesting story that we tell ourselves about grief, and
Mm-hmm.
that somehow it's going to be easier because you knew it was coming,
Yeah.
and it's not, right? So
And
my dad died of
completely
cancer.
to be completely honest with you, when and I when I hear this, like some people said that, oh, you should be prepared, should be you should know this, you
Mm,
should prepare for this when this time comes. For me, I think it's stupid, because not in a way
yeah,
that you're thinking, but if there's still a fighting chance to
yeah,
recover from it, do it. But don't give up already. It's really pissed me off when when some people say, "Oh, you should prepare for this one day," because they're already giving up, and it's very difficult
yeah.
for someone who that experiencing this. They want to fight, but when they hear this from those people, it's very difficult to process. I'm sorry to cut you off, but
Yeah,
there's people like
no, no,
that.
no. Yeah. And I think it's so, what we say to each other is so often so harmful. It's
Yeah,
so hurtful. Even though we're trying to be supportive, we say such hurtful things.
exactly.
And that's one of them, right?
Yeah.
You should have expected this. Well, why? Why would I want to spend any of the time I have left with my loved one planning for when they're not here anymore? That,
Mhm.
like, on a fundamental level, makes no sense to me at all. I think that what people should understand is that even though on one level you knew it was coming, that doesn't lessen the grief,
Mhm.
right? The grief still has to be felt and acknowledged and lived. And, in some ways, sometimes it can make it more complicated because you end up with anticipatory grief because you're anticipating that this person is probably going to die while you're hoping that they don't, which is also super complicated, right? So their last months or years of their life, sometimes, depending on how long their cancer journey was, can be spent in that complicated place. And then when it finally happens, you have people coming at you with this expectation that somehow you should be able to cope better because you had warning.
Mhm.
So
Exactly.
now think of how isolated you are, right? You've spent
Mhm.
however long, likely at the bedside, pursuing whatever medical things you could, supporting your loved one as best you can, which isolates you from people because that becomes your focus. And then when they pass away, people come at you with this nonsensical garbage about how you should be coping better because you knew it was coming. Like, it's just all bad.
Yeah.
It becomes all bad. So, what I would say to those parents is, first of all, I'm so sorry that anybody has to go through something like that. I'm so sorry that it happened to them and to their loved one. And just take permission. Give yourself permission. I give you permission. Give yourself permission to grieve however you needed to, because you're also grieving the life they lost while they were still alive, but they were sick,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're grieving that part of their life. You're grieving that now they're gone and they're not here anymore. You also have big gaps in your life because all the time that you spent taking care of them, that becomes a huge part of your identity as a caregiver. So now a big part of your identity is also gone. And if it's also your child, that disrupts your identity even more.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are feeling confused, if you are feeling desperately, desperately sad and dismayed and disappointed, all of that is normal. And know that it's normal. And people will support you. People will want to help you. They won't always know how,
Mm-hmm.
and they won't always do it in the way that you want. And we have to receive and give grace about how imperfectly people show up.
Yeah.
And it's okay to say, you know what? I don't choose to believe that. I don't choose to hear that story. That's your story, and I don't choose to believe that.
And
Just get through each day. That's all you can do at the beginning, right? Is just get through each day. It will shift. It will change. You know, this too shall pass, to go back to your mantra, right? This too
mm-hmm.
shall pass. And you will carry that person with you. They're not gone. You will carry them with you.
And that's the perfect way to end this podcast. Suzanne, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for sharing those stories. I really appreciate it. And I hope that a lot of people really, we help a lot of people by doing this.
Yes.
Because I think having this kind of conversation is very important in somewhat. It's not a not a lot of people really want to talk about this or want to talk about grief in general because it's very difficult and you have to walk in an eggshell on that. And I'm
Yeah.
so happy that you share your stories and you know um you're doing this for other people. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you opening this conversation.
So with that being said, where they can find you, Suzanne?
The easiest place to find me is on my website, which is alivedexperience.com, which I'm sure you will put in the show notes. So check the show notes.
Yep.
That's the best place. It's got my blog is there. So anytime I'm writing, what I'm learning, what I'm discovering is all there. Any workshops I have coming up are there. You can reach out to me by email if you need support and you want some grief coaching or some education. That's the best place to get a hold of me. And there's a link on the website to all my social media handles. So that's the easiest place. If you're an Instagram person, you can click and follow there. Same as Facebook and YouTube, they're all there. So that's the best one-stop shop to find everything I'm up to.
That's great. Nick Barellano podcast is available on Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify. And again, Suzanne, thank you so much for coming. With that being said, peace
Thank
out,
you
people.
so much.
They tell me that I'm never gonna make it. They want me to do something that could make sense. They hate when I keep dreaming I'll be famous, but I don't give a fuck, I'ma keep chasing. I got all this potential that's deep inside of me, but they hate when you're successful cause they try to be. They sit there being judgmental because you're trying things, and they just want you to settle and do the right thing. So get a good job, don't slack off. Wake up every morning, make a good impression on your boss. Don't do anything that I wouldn't do, and when you're making money, make sure you don't spend it too soon. Fuck that, I'll do what I wanna do. I got a different path from everyone, and that includes you. Who are you to tell me how to live life? In these times it feels like nobody is right, yeah. So I'ma figure out what else we succeed, and then invest all of my time into that and proceed. I need whatever the hell could make me happy, and I don't think you have a clue what could that be. They tell me that I'm never gonna make it. They want me to do something that could make sense. They hate when I keep dreaming I'll be famous, but I don't give a fuck, I'ma keep chasing. They tell me that I'm never gonna make it. They want me to do something that could make sense. They hate when I keep dreaming I'll be famous, but I don't give a fuck, I'ma keep chasing. I think this life could be special if I get rid of the devils. They think that I am a rebel, I think they want me to settle. There's nobody on my level. They think that work is too stressful, I think that work is essential. The grind is all in your mental, and I don't think you understand what I'll go through just to be in control of my life soon. All the negativity, man, I'm immune. I don't really need a mask with all I've been through. I've been making changes for the ages. 5-10 year plans are contagious. I attack that shit, I'm tenacious. And if you ain't, get the fuck out of my way then. Got one life, I won't regret it. I will fight until I get it. I'll look back one day from heaven and say, damn, I learned some lessons. And say, damn, I had no questions. I had fun in every second, and the journey was a blessing, yeah. They tell me that I'm never gonna make it.